You, you know how to add me. That was magic. I didn't even see you. Your hands were in the air, and somehow I came on.
I do have magical superpowers. How are you?
I am very good. You don't want to give credit to the love of your life there that you told me that you said earlier was handling the tech for you?
He has been pretty fantastic. He did come in to let me know that you were ready, so we didn't keep you waiting for too long.
Okay, because my significant other, she'd let me have it if I didn't give her, the appropriate due and took credit for her work. But that is a man-gendered problem we have often, is men taking credit for women's work.
I've heard that's a thing.
Yes, it is.
So
it is.
Tell me how you're really doing.
So first of all, that was great to watch. I thought that was a great conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to know how you're really doing in this moment. You are a Black man in America living through this nonsense yet again. How are you doing?
Look, this has been, first of all, I appreciate you saying really doing, because a lot of times we ask that question, we don't slow down to hear the answer. But it's been an emotionally supercharged week where or now more than a week, 2 weeks, with just feeling every emotion. Really, I'm raw. I'm from rage and anger to just grief. This sort of unpacked grief that you build up over years that gets calloused over as you go about life. Suddenly, that's just ripped open and stuff comes out. So it's been the weirdest thing for me, because I'm not like a weepy guy, yeah. But I've definitely had these like normal sort of highbrow interviews where I've just gotten emotional, and it's hard. And especially when I start talking about the fact that we've been at this for decades. I remember taking to the streets in college after the Rodney King verdict and writing one of the most emotional charged columns for our student newspaper, Stanford's newspaper. And I read that new article on the floor, a column on the floor of the Senate, because I just wanted to show people nothing has substantively, the words I wrote then about the how somehow capturing everyday American reality for Black Americans on videotape, and still you can't get justice. And the sort of stinging reality that article, interestingly, I entitled it, "Why Have I Lost Control?" Is now something I'm still feeling now. So this has been a moment of great emotional tumult for me and millions of other Americans. But I actually think it's a really good thing to let this stuff out and to channel it into what I'm witnessing now. We were marching back 30 years ago, little less than 30 years ago. But now it's like in a little short period of time, you see diverse racial coalitions, religious, ethnic, age, all 50 states, small towns, big cities. And this is in a time of a pandemic when, let's be frank, it'd probably be 2x the number of people, if not more, out there marching. So this gives me hope, and I'm about to introduce legislation tomorrow that would not have been possible 3 weeks ago. And we have, my sister and partner in this, Kamala Harris, partnered with, on the House side, Karen Bass, who's head of the Congressional Black Caucus, Nadler, who is the head of the House Judiciary Committee, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer. We're coming together tomorrow to put forward the most advanced police reform legislation in ever.
I love it.
So, and we're going to get, and I've been having conversations with Senate colleagues all day, we're going to get a lot of co-sponsors of this legislation, people jumping on board. So I am, at one point, like a lot of folks are, everything is suspect because a lot of us have been involved in reforms before and haven't seen the substantive changes. So everything has got to be suspect. But I am encouraged that in American history, every great advancement, suffrage movement, abolitionist movement, civil rights movement, to get the Americans with Disabilities Act, labor movement, all of them have not been led by people in office in Washington. It's been led by people in the streets, nonviolent protesters. There's an old saying, change doesn't come from Washington, it comes to Washington. And so here we have this broad coalition demanding this change, giving a lot of space in here for me and others to actually write legislation that now has more of a chance of passing than ever before. Substantive, real change that could save people's lives.
So I want to hear more about what you're planning to introduce, you know, whatever you're allowed to share, because one of the things that I have struggled with in this conversation around race is so many people want to say, you know, it's not political. It's about hearts and minds, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't believe that. I think fundamentally, because of where we are, you know, we're not just talking about racist people and some of the racist comments that pop up in this chat. We're talking about a matter of life and death, especially for Black men in this country. And so I want to hear more about, you know, what you're planning to introduce and how we can all support you.
Well, I just want to pick on that issue for a second because it's such a powerful point you just made, and we shouldn't let it go. The racism is baked within the system. It doesn't necessitate, like white supremacists, they've been with us. They will always be with us. I wish we were doing more to combat it. More people have died from right wing and white supremacist terrorists since 9/11 than since foreign terrorists. So let's be clear. I can name everything from, you know, attacks on mosques, attacks on a black church in South Carolina. White supremacists and right-wing extremists are killing more people since 9/11 than the terrorists that are so glamorized, or not glamorized, but so focused on by the national media, I should say, appropriately. So what you're saying is something more insidious. So let me put myself out there to be really real. I'm an African American guy. I was elected to be mayor of the largest city in New Jersey. We had a black police chief. We had a majority black city council. We knew we had inherited a police department with generations, going back to the riots, of challenges, and we set about reforming it. And we felt like we were making progress, right? And it wasn't until the DOJ came in and did a deeper dive on the data than we had the capacity to do that brought up and saying, you guys aren't moving that fast. Look at all this bias baked into the police stops that were being made, the patterns and practices. And so here is a lot of actors with all good intentions. We did some really good things, drug courts and youth courts and prisoner reentry programs. I'm proud of a lot of work we were doing. But for the average African American who's experiencing that police department, it's not fast enough. And so there's a lot of good lip service. There's a lot of good intentions. There's a lot of work and activity, but we can't mistake activity for progress when the bigger issues. We've got to find a way to go through. And so I just want to put myself out there to say, it's not like, it's not this conscious racism that's out there. It's this understanding that implicit racial bias, institutional bias is baked into every element of our life. I'm not being overly dramatic when I say this.
No, not at all.
As an African-American woman, you are more likely to die in childbirth, 3-4 times more than a white woman. And how much money you make has no effect.
No, not at all.
Not at all. It's a black child. They've done studies controlling for everything, more likely to get out of school suspensions than a white child. A black boy is more likely to have his age misunderstood, so that people expect them to be older, more of a threat. I could go through economics. You could go through a great Harvard study that was done about who's more likely to get hired, a white person, a black person, a white person with a criminal conviction, a black person with a criminal conviction. And they actually found that for some jobs that it would be the white person without a criminal conviction, or white person with a criminal conviction, than a black person. You can go through all things where they've done the same resumes, just separating pictures or changing the names. So we know that and we've had big leaders in our society admit this. Former head of the FBI said, if I'm walking down a street and I look on one side of the street and there's black youth and one side of the street and there's white youth, I will reflexively think that the black youth are more of a threat. So from economics to healthcare, the number one predictor in America, whether you live around a toxic site or not, the best predictive indicator to look at is a person's race. And so when when you go through these things, you begin to understand, and much of this is the legacy of generations of laws that went all the way up to the 60s and 70s that were over. My parents had to get a white couple to pose as them in 1969 to buy a house to grow up. And even when they confronted the real estate agent for breaking the law, the real estate agent punched my dad's lawyer and sicked a dog on my father. So this is 1969. So if you don't think that is still an affection, and so the question is not, I'm tired of the question of who is and who is not a racist. That's not the important question. The important question is, does racism exist or not? And if your answer is yes, then the question is what are you doing about it? Because it's not enough to say I'm not a racist. The question is what kind of anti-racist are you? And that goes for Black people too.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, it goes for all of us. And so many of us who enjoy these rights and privileges that we didn't earn. In other words, you name, I don't care if you're Irish, if you're gay, if you're a woman, you're enjoying privileges that people sweat, died, bled for. All of us are. We're in this country where if you look at humanity, the mere fact that we can mention that we're American, we have industrial nation privilege, okay? And for us not to recognize that we can't pay that back, we've got to pay it forward by fighting for the broader justices. So I just want to use that as a framing. Let's get out of this idea that, oh, I'm not a racist, I'm not sexist. No, it's what are you doing about those ills that exist in our society? Because the last thing I'll say, then I'll get into your specific question about tomorrow, is we don't stop to recognize the jarring incongruencies between our words and the reality in America. Everybody here has put their hands on their heart and said, swore an oath, we're a nation of liberty and justice for all. Those words represent a nation in search of itself, because we haven't achieved that. We live in this land where we call ourselves the home of the brave, and we incarcerate more people than any nation on the planet Earth.
Yeah.
1 out of every 3 incarcerated women on the planet are here in the United States, and overwhelmingly nonviolent. Overwhelmingly survivors, over 80% are survivors of sexual trauma. And then we compound the trauma by shackling pregnant women in prison, by not training male security guards on trauma-informed care. So you're marching in on women undressed, using the bathrooms and more. If you go to prisons like I have, if you sit and talk to incarcerated women who are forced to make their own tampons because we don't have menstrual equity in this country, these things are all things that take hurt people and hurt them more.
Yes.
And then release them into a country that says, if you have a nonviolent drug conviction for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing, that you have a lifetime sentence because you can't get a loan from a bank, can't get a Pell Grant, can't get a job, can't feed your families, and so on and so forth. So I can continue to deplore the system. We torture children in prison by putting them in solitary confinement. I could go through all that, but now let's talk about the fixes. Because
what are we doing and how can we help you?
Yes, Martin Luther King said it so eloquent. I love what he said. He says, I can't legislate you to love me, but I can legislate you not to lynch me. I can't pass a law to change your heart, but I can pass laws to restrain the heartless, right? So let's just start there. Let's stop people from lynching folks. And I use that dramatic language, but we saw in broad daylight.
Dramatic at this point.
Yeah, we saw in broad daylight a murder with impunity. They knew they were being filmed, and so our legislation is going to be banning practices, chokeholds, no knock entries that killed Breonna Taylor, no knock warrants, a lot of these practices. It's going to make sure police can be held accountable, getting rid of something called qualified immunity that stops them from being accountable to civil penalties, something that allows them to be subject to criminal prosecution on the federal level. And then also does a lot to create more transparency so Americans can know what's going on in their police departments. How many use of force is, when they use force, what do the people that they're using force look like racially, demographically? What about police involved killing? We don't collect that data. Let's see what's happening right now, because you saw this with Ahmaud Arbery. You see this with Breonna Taylor. People, this stuff is happening out there, but we don't even know about it until something happens, like a videotape comes forward or something like that. So this is the most sweeping bill ever on police accountability. And it wasn't possible a month ago because people in the streets have been leading this change, making space for this change. And what you can do to help is to begin to name the bill and demand that your representatives get on the bill,
Okay.
and let's build this. So I'll try to make sure that my staff gets you, if you want to post it, like there's a general number to call for the Washington, one number you can just ask, tell them where you live, they'll tell you who your representative is or your senator is. And this is not partisan, this is common sense. And we're hoping that we get more and more people on this legislation. It's basically were you on the 1964 Civil Rights Bill? Are you on the 1965 Voting Rights Bill? Are you on the 1968 Fair Housing Bill? Well, I want people to ask, are you on the 2020 Police Accountability Bill, Justice and Policing Bill? And that's really what they can do. But I think that Bartunde had a couple questions for me that I heard. And I don't want him out there. Listen, he's a good brother. We have respect between each other, I'm sure. But he'll talk about me if I don't answer his questions, right? Like, I just know he will. And you notice how he dropped. I got my podcast. I got my thing coming up.
So
I felt like I didn't know if he meant it as a threat, but I thought he kind of was saying, if Cory doesn't answer my questions. So I want to be clear with him that Mitch McConnell most likely will not put this bill on the floor for a vote. The House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, will bring this to a vote. They're going to start the process of marking up a bill. But he's right. If in 5 months in November we don't change the control of the Senate, not only this bill, I'll go through the bills. I mean, you've got anything to deal with climate change, forget it. They won't do it. Anything to do with the Affordable Care Act, preserving people with pre-existing conditions, not going to happen. I can go through all the issues that the majority of Americans, not partisan, legalizing marijuana. I can go through the bills that the majority of Americans would support, that Mitch McConnell has been stopping from getting to the floor. And so the only thing I can say to that is vote. Vote. You represent the demographic, Black women in America, that have the highest voter turnout percentages. Well, 66% to me, in school, if you got 66%.
Not the best grade.
Not the best grade. It is the best relative to all other demographics. But if African Americans voted at 70-something%, if women voters voted at 70, talk about women's rights and securing a Roe v. Wade, for example, I would love to see that passed as a law of our land legislatively. All of these things necessitate higher voter turnouts than we're seeing right now. If there's ever any election, I feel like 2020 is trying to tell this country, we're going to give you 1930s like depression economically. We're going to give you a pandemic. We're going to force y'all out to the streets because too many of y'all got comfortable. All of these things are heading towards this big colossal election where you have a president up whose own generals now are turning on him, who just turned in front of, ever since Alice Paul, the first person ever to be arrested in front of the White House for protesting for suffrage rights. Ever since her, this is the first president really like turning the forces against peaceful protesters in front. So there's so much on this ballot that I'm not telling you who to vote for, but come on now, if you turn out to vote, you'll make a difference in a lot of these Senate races and a lot of these this in the presidential race. But it's even deeper than this, because people forget that the local elections, when you say what you can do, the federal government doesn't have as much power over police as local leaders do. And so your prosecutor, many states, those are elected. Judges in so many states are elected. Mayors over your towns are elected. And so you want to make sure that you're asking questions about where people stand on these issues. But when greater voter turnout happens in this country, it usually shows a big steps forward in terms of issues of justice, equality, and inclusion in this country. We saw the 2018 elections were some of the highest voter turnout elections in the history of midterm elections. And in a blink of the eye, dramatic changes. You have Native Americans serving. You have more openly gay people serving. It just became such a much more diverse world out there when people participate. So that's the last thing I'll say. What you can do is, all the things that we hope you'll do to advocate for legislation that makes sense to you, only if it makes sense to you specifically, like we saw in the civil rights movement, they were asking for specific legislation often. But then the next thing is participate in this in a way and demand those officials are accountable to what you want to see as we reimagine policing in this country. And we reimagine, frankly, so many issues to make this a more beloved community. Because that's the last thing I'll say. Now you're never going to invite me back because I'm talking too much. But this is very important to say. We have decided complicitly or explicitly in this country that we will treat mental health issues with police and jail. We've decided we're either complicit with it or it's explicitly being done that we are treating addiction in this country with jail and police. We've decided we're going to criminalize poverty in this country. Anybody who's had warrants out for their arrest, for unpaid tickets, and more, we criminalize poverty in this country. We've decided we're going to criminalize race in this country. More likely to be, and that's the irony, is black people are more likely to be stopped by police, but when white people are stopped, they find drugs more. Yeah. So we have decided that we're going to deal in our prisons and our jails with all kind of problems. And it's such a poor reflection of the love we have in our society, the reservoirs of love and compassion we have. And it also makes no fiscal sense. There's lots of studies, but my favorite one is in Seattle. They just said, what's more expensive, to have Americans with mental illness homeless on the streets or put them in supportive housing? They studied the cost and they found out that it was so much more expensive to keep them homeless on the street because they ended up where? Hospital emergency rooms and jails involving police and first responders. I mean, we've created a society where we are hurting those populations more and more by sticking them in institutions that not only do not serve them, but hurt them. And then when you come out, if you're poor, you're more stuck in poverty when you come out. If you're addicted, your addiction has not been treated, you're more vulnerable. If you're mentally ill, you've often had things happen to you that trigger your mental illness and further hurt your mental illness. And if you're African American, well, you know what? You now live in a society where more African Americans are under criminal supervision than all the slaves in 1850, because we have so criminalized one population of this country. And so this is more than just a policing issue. It is an issue of how we are going to choose to deal with the vulnerable and marginalized in our country. Will we deal with them with love, support, elevating human dignity and human well-being, or will we deal with them with police and prisons where we harm well-being and assault dignity and ultimately create generational problems? Because the children of all these incarcerated people, trauma.
It's terrible. We need to figure out how we stop starting people in this country. I'm going to ask you one last question because I know we're over time. But in the middle of this very difficult moment, when there are all these demands on your time and you're trying to make this legislation happen for the rest of us out here, how are you finding joy? Like, what are you doing to take care of yourself?
Lots of connection with friends where you laugh and you cry. And I'm sure you've had those conversations where 1 second you're crying, 1 second you're laughing. I have an incredible significant other who has taught me the hard lessons of my life about that it's okay to be needy. It's okay to have to reach out. And I've been reading a lot of really good people. I feel like I'm reading more spiritual books recently, from Martin Luther King's sermons to Brene Brown, who talks about the courage and being vulnerable, and that is actually showing great strength and courage. So, and then the last thing is lots of gospel.
Yes, I did Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace.
Oh, one of the best. I have this gospel mix that I just have overplayed, and then Spotify suggests new ones for me, and I'm always just adding on. So I have a gospel list with probably 100 songs on it. I just put it on mix, and I hadn't listened to it this whole weekend because we were negotiating this bill. This morning, it just sourced my soul. So I've been leaning on the Lord and leaning on friends more than I normally do, and actually letting my emotions out more than I often do, and realizing there's a lot of pent up stuff in there that I probably should have let out a long time ago.
Well, I am glad that you are finding ways to support yourself even during this difficult time. I really appreciate you taking the time for this chat, and I'm going to make sure I connect with your team so we can share the information on how we can support you right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Take care now.
Of course. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Okay. Huge thanks to everyone who turned in. And I see a bunch of you have been telling me to block someone. I actually don't know how to do that because this is my first Instagram Live, but I promise I will figure it out for next time. And I hope that everyone is finding ways to really take care of themselves and unplug and find joy in this moment while you also work to support others and help us all reimagine a better future. Thank you so much.